I was going through this idea about these two basic arguments, moral duty to improve well-being, economic argument. Now, this link between social origins and well-being, we all know about this. You know, if you're born poor, you're going to have poor health throughout life, much more likely to have poor health, etc. We have poor education, a whole range of things. And early years are critical in breaking this link between social origins and well-being. And that's something about the game. Okay, that's okay. Now, so we have, you know, that's the context in which we find ourselves. And we need to think about working in the early years. And there's a lot of work about the early years. But I'm just going to say a few words before I talk about the early years evidence about some basic work which I think we neglect in the early years. The thing about some basic work on brain development. Everything we do, feel, or say, listening to me now, you're feeling this stupid bugger, whatever might be feeling. That's all reflects activity in your brain, okay? And so let's just think of some basic facts of brain development. At birth, you have up to 100 billion neurons, that's nerve cells, and that's all you get, okay? They start dying off after that. Now, brain development is not about increasing the number of neurons. It's about the synapses between the neurons, developing the synapses, the junctions between neurons. And in the first year of life, you increase these synapses by about 700 per second. Just think of that. That little baby just had 700 new synapses. That's an absolutely incredible thing. Now, most connections, these synapses, are made in the first year of life. And 60% of all that food we give little babies gets used up in forming synapses. 60% of it. Okay? That falls to about 30% by age 3. And by age 3, 80% of synaptic connections are made. Now, synapses and the way in which they develop are the basis of our learning and the basis of our capacity to change and adapt to the environment. And this happens through a process of pruning of the synapses. So what happens is you get an explosion of synapses, and then the ones which are reinforced by experience get kept and strengthened, and the ones which aren't reinforced by experience drop out because it's a pruning exercise. We get pruning of synapses, not reinforced by experience. In other words, use it or lose it, okay? Now that applies to many aspects in life, okay? Now, synapses decline basically up to about age 10. And synapse development influences brain plasticity. That is, all change as a result of experience it involves the synapse development, and this capacity declines with age. Now, these are some slides I first of all used in my PhD thesis. I won't tell you how many years ago that was, but this is from a well-known neuroanatomist. And this is a slice of the brain at birth. And you see those neurons there, and there aren't very many junctions between those neurons, okay? Then, the same area of the brain when the child's 2 years of age, and we see a mass of connections, okay? Then the same area of the brain at 6 years of age, still a lot of connections, but look, there's a lot less connections here than there were at 2. That's because the ones which weren't reinforced by experience dropped out, okay? Now, this is a very well-known graph, which you'll see from the book Neurons to the Neighborhoods. And it shows the process of synaptic development for different parts of, for different kinds of functioning. Hearing and vision is like this. You get a peak here of the synapses just after birth. And then they fall off over the first year of life. Okay, so this is months up to here, and then it's years after that. Now this is language, so we get a peak in language of synapses around 9 months of age, and then they fall off to about 4 years of age. Then we have higher cognitive functioning, like reasoning, problem solving, a peak around just after 1 year of age and falls off into adolescence. Now when you look at a graph like that, you think, look at the blue line. The peak's around 9 months of age. That must be when all the learning is taking place. No, it's not. That's a big mistake lots of people make. The learning takes place here, in the fall off, because this is when the synapses are getting pruned as a result of experience. Okay? So the maximum learning period for language, 9 months to 4 years of age. Okay? That's not to take the learning outside that period. So if you think about we need to make sure in that period, up to 4 years of age, we're providing adequate language experience for our children, else they're not going to develop good language skills. And a child who reaches age 3, with poor language is almost guaranteed, unless you intervene in quite a heavy way, to have poor literacy in school, poor educational outcomes, etc., etc. Catherine Snow's work at Harvard shows that the best predictor of later literacy at the end of school is initial language vocabulary in those early years of life. Okay? Now so what all of you should be doing is making sure that the children you're responsible for have good language development by age 3. Okay? If they don't, you need to intervene at that point, because if you try to intervene later, it's going to be bloody difficult to produce a change. Okay? Right. Now, this process of synaptic development and openness to experience is going to be affected by the patterns of experience. And there are certain kinds of adverse experiences that can happen in early childhood. You may get abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. You may lose a parent. You may have ill health, a whole range of things like that, okay? Which are much more common in disadvantaged than not disadvantaged. And this is a survey of 17,000 Americans about asking them, did this kind of thing happen when you were a young child? And what you find is 36% of the population report no adverse childhood experiences. 26% report 1, 16% report 2, 9% report 3, and 12% report 4 or more. Okay, that's a kind of spread of adverse childhood experiences, which might be anticipated to interfere, as it were, with the developmental process I've been talking about. Now, if we look at what's the link between these adverse childhood experiences and development, this is intellectual development, developmental delay, cognitive developmental delay. And you see a baseline figure down there of 5% for those who only have up to 1 or 2 adverse childhood experiences. That's the sort of general population level of incidence of cognitive delay. Yeah? Then, when they have 3 adverse experiences, it jumps up to 18%. With 4, it jumps up to 44%. With 5, it jumps up to 74%. With 6, up to 88%. And look, if you have 7 of these adverse childhood experiences all clustered together, you're almost guaranteed to have a developmental delay, 98% incidence. Very clear link between these adverse childhood experiences and developmental delay. But it's not just cognitive factors. Here's the link with depression, adult depression, the likelihood of suffering depression by adulthood. And this is in terms of odds ratios. So 1 means the baseline level for the population. So 0 adverse childhood experiences, no particular increased risk of depression at all. The risk increases, as you see there, markedly as the adverse childhood experiences increase, up to. So if you have 5 or more adverse childhood experiences, you're 5 times more likely to have depression. Okay. Now, here's another way of looking at this work. These are 2 fMRI scans. That's where they look at the pattern of brain activity in a functioning brain. It's a big magnetic resonance device. It's like a big tube. You stick you inside it. And you may have had one, actually, if you have been in the hospital for some sort of. This is the scan from a normal 5-year-old. Then next to it, is the scan from a 5-year-old who's been raised in a Romanian orphanage with extreme deprivation. The differences are quite dramatic. Okay? So we're seeing lots of evidence from different periods. That you can see a concrete link between patterns of experience, brain development, and then subsequent functioning. And I want to just emphasize the importance of language development. Because language development underpins cognitive, educational, and social development. A child with poor language, as I said earlier, at age 3 will be at risk unless intervention's taken. Now, this is the very famous studies by Hart and Risley in America, where they looked at families in welfare homes, that is very, very poor, deprived homes, then working class, sort of ordinary, but not rich families. Then we have professional families. And what they did is they had a recorder in the homes which switched itself on at different periods in the day to record the language heard in the vicinity of the child. Okay? So what you see in the welfare homes is about 500 words per hour heard in a child's vicinity. Then it's about 1,200 words for the working class families and about 2,200 words for the professional families. But it's not just the sheer quantity of words which show a big difference between those families. It's the kind of words. Now, red is affirmations, and blue is prohibitions. So an affirmation is, oh, that's nice. Why don't you do that again? Okay, let's try it. Go on. Whereas a prohibition is, stop! Get out my way! Don't do that! You know, okay? What you see in the welfare homes is a predominance of prohibitions over affirmations, reverse in the working class, and then in the professional homes, a huge dominance of affirmations. So it's not just the quantity of words, it's the quality of those words. There's also a very big differences. Now, by the time the child's 4 years old, the 4th birthday, they calculate that the child in the welfare home will have heard 12 million words on average. The child in the working class home will have heard about 25 million words, and the child in the professional home will have heard about 42 million words. So the gap between here and here is 30 million words. Okay? Now, if you give one child 30 million words more experience than the other child, what's going to happen? You're going to get massive differences in language development. And what do we find? These are the graphs of the words that the child is capable of in these different homes. We see the professional families here, the red line, clearly above the blue line, which is the working class homes, and then at the bottom we have the welfare homes. And that's over the first 3 years of life. Very clear consequences for language development, okay? Now, there's another. This is something which I came across very recently. It's only 2013, published in a very well-known medical research journal. What they did is they measured the total amount of gray matter in the brain. That's the bit of the brain that forms the cortex, okay? And they measured it at different months, from 5 months there up to 37 months of age here. And the green line are children who are growing up in professional, the higher social class families. The red line is children growing up in the sort of working class, ordinary kind of families. And the blue line are the children growing up in disadvantage. Okay? Just look at those graphs I just showed you. Look at that one. Then look at that one. Can you see some similarity? Okay, so what I'm talking about here is these environmental experiences are having a real impact on brain development, which in turn have long-term consequences right through life. Okay, evidence at the behavioral level, 0 to 3 years. And I'm going to particularly talk here about early childcare. There's a very well-known Abacadarian project, a sample of about 120 children, I think, in North Carolina, randomly assigned to either receive very high-quality daycare, with lots of adult-child interaction, with highly trained staff and so on, from, I think, about 3 months of age, actually, right through to the start of school at 6 years of age. And then another group who didn't get the intervention at all. So we have an intervention group and a control group. And they followed through these children up to age 21. And I think there have been subsequent follow-ups beyond age 21. And over these first 21 years, they found that higher cognitive development from 18 months on, greater social competence from preschool on, better school achievement, more college attendance, delayed childbearing, that is less teenage pregnancy. So not only does that generation get better, the subsequent generation are having better conditions as well. Better employment, less smoking, less drug use. All as a consequence of high quality childcare being provided to these disadvantaged families, because they were all disadvantaged families, in those early years of life. And that's a very well-known study, the Abecedarian Project. And it's one of the few examples of what we call a randomized controlled trial in this area. A randomized controlled trial is where you randomly assign people to a treatment or not a treatment. And because it's random, you assume that all the differences between the two groups are balanced out. Okay? You can, in reality, only do it with very disadvantaged populations because they're the only populations which are desperate enough to do what you tell them to do because they have no alternative. Our randomized controlled trials are almost impossible to use with the general population, which is why when I did a study back in the 1980s in the UK, we weren't able to do a randomized controlled trial with the general population. What we did is we worked in the 4 largest maternity units in London. And when a baby was born in that unit, within a few days after the birth of the baby, we'd ask the mother 4 questions. Is it your first child? Are you living with the child's father? Were you both working up to the birth of the child? And where were you born? Okay, and so we had basically, and we selected a group who were all born in England, who were all 2-parent families, who were all having their first child, and who'd all been working up to the birth of the child. Okay, and then they had a choice. Do they return to work and use childcare, or do they stay at home and look after the child? Okay, and then what we had is we ended up with 4 groups. A group where the mother, almost always, stayed at home, looked after the child. Another group where the mother returned to work and they used a relative like a grandmother. Another group who used childminders. Another group who used a nursery or group daycare. And we followed through these children over the first 6 years of life, collecting lots and lots of data on the environments of these children. And in particular, we focused on affection, communication, and responsiveness in the interactions that these children had, whether they were in the home, or with the grandmother, or with the childminder, or in the day nursery. Okay? And we found big differences between these aspects of experience in these environments. These are the amount of affection which we saw in these different environments. In the home, the light blue is the lowest, the dark blue is the average, and the white is the most that we saw. And so if you look across those graphs, therefore, this is affection acts per hour. How often is that somebody would hug the child or kiss the child or say an affectionate word to the child? Okay, those sorts of things. And you see that the home and the relative are very similar. In fact, the relatives show more affection than the mothers do. This is the grandmother effect. Okay. Okay? Then we have childminders, a bit less. And then we have the nurseries, less again. Childminders, I think, are interesting. We saw that some extremely low levels of interaction amongst childminders and some extremely high levels. Huge range amongst childminders, enormous range. Okay, so that's affection. So big differences in those environments. Communications. Okay, green is home, blue's relative, grey, and then another grey, or brown as it's supposed to be, nursery. You can see clearly communications to the child over there show big differences between those environments. Communications by the child. These are 18-month-old children. So some of these 18-month-old children will be saying a few words, but many of their communications would be non-language. So we looked at language and then non-language. Again, there are differences between those environments in the communications the child itself does as a consequence of the stimulation from the adults. Then we had a look at responsiveness. How likely is it that given the child makes the communication, would somebody respond to it? And we looked at, and then it's over 60% in the home, but only about 40% in the nurseries. Okay. Now, we then looked at language development in these children, allowing for social class differences and family income, parent education, and so on. And this is 18-month-olds. When the children were 18 months old, we took measures of their number of words they had, but not only the number of words they had, but the number of word combinations that they made. Like, bye-bye, daddy, give me milk, or whatever. You know, these little two-word combinations. Okay? Now, most children at 18 months will have some individual words, but few of them will have word combinations. So we see the percentages here. Most children in all of these groups don't show word combinations. Then we have some children who show a small number of word combinations, then a moderate amount of word combinations, then a lot of word combinations. And what you see here, look at this group down here, 17%, 23%, 10%, 3%. Big differences in what might be called advanced language development in these groups, which was directly linked to the patterns of experience in those groups, okay? And overall, over the first 6 years of life, we found that after controlling for family background factors, language development was related to the quality of care those children received, whether it was in the home, whether it was the childminder, whether it was with the nursery, or whether it was the grandmother, was related to the quality of care in the first 3 years, particularly communication and responsiveness in interactions, and these effects persisted until the end of the study when the children were 6 years of age. And stability of care, how frequently the caregiver changed, was also linked to that quality of care. Okay? And results from that study informed the 1989 Children Act in the UK, which is really the first act to impose childcare regulation. Up until that point, child regulation virtually didn't exist in the UK. There were theoretical laws, but they were never applied. And therefore, the range of differences we found between childcare environments in the 1980s, you would not find them today as a result of the 1989 Children Act. Okay. Now, another source of UK evidence linked to 0 to 3 and later is what we call Sure Start. You've probably all heard of Sure Start, and you probably all have a different idea about what Sure Start is, because one of the things we've wrestled with, both within the UK and outside the UK, Sure Start means different things to different people, partly on the basis of their experience and partly on what they want to believe. Okay. Now, in 1997, we had a new Labour government came to power, and one of the commitments of this Labour government was a commitment to breaking the cycle of disadvantage. You all know what that is, right? Okay. So the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, tells, this is an interesting story about the juxtaposition of politics and early years. The first thing Gordon Brown does when he comes to power as Chancellor of the Exchequer is he hands over control of interest rates to the Bank of England. That is, the Bank of England is independent of government. So in other words, the government has given away power over the interest rates. Now, you may think, what on earth has this got to do with the early years? Well, what happened was, as a consequence of the Treasury giving up responsibility for interest rates, a whole load of economists, very high-powered economists in the Treasury, suddenly didn't have anything to do. And so what Gordon Brown did is he took the chief economist, a chap called Norman Glass, and he said, Norman, I want you to go away and look at all the evidence on the cycle of disadvantage and produce a report for me about what we should do to break it. Okay? Norman Glass goes away, he reads all the relevant literature, talks to academics, talks to people in the field, comes back a year later and hands his report in. This report says, there's a complex report, but the basic story behind this, basic message behind this report is, unless we do something in the early years, we're wasting our time. That's the basic story of that report. Okay? So then Gordon Brown, as a result of that report, announces, okay, we're going to start a massive new early years program, which we're going to call Sure Start, which is going to provide lots of new highly developed services for children from birth onwards, etc. Okay? Announced it in 1980, 98. It was actually 2000 before the first Sure Start program started to get set up. Now, Sure Start set up around 2000. Naomi Eisenstadt, who you may have come across, she's visited Victoria a couple of times, was the first director of Sure Start. And that was a very lucky thing that she was the very first director, because she was very, very good at getting her way within the bureaucracy. Because when you're working with a system which has been going for decades under the same model, and then you're trying to introduce a completely new model of operating, it's tremendously difficult, because within that bureaucracy there are tremendous vested interests about keeping things the way they've always been, and you're trying to change them. So there was a huge battle there that Naomi was very effective in. And the basic model behind the very first Sure Start programs was what could be phrased in the idea, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Okay? So if you lived in an area with poor children in it, and you said, oh, we want to be a Sure Start program, we'll get together, somebody from the local authority, somebody from health, somebody from social services, somebody from education, and a parent representative. You form your committee, and you basically write a prospectus. And it didn't really matter what was in the prospectus. All that matters is you had to sign up to these general goals of doing good for children with families with children with a young child. And you would then get the money. And that money was £1,000 per child per year for every child within your community. Which, given that these communities typically had 800 children in those early years, 0 to 4, that was 800,000 in income per year. And on top of that, you had other many hundreds of thousands in capital expenditure. So the amount of money being given out to these programs was huge. Now, this was huge in an area where, prior to this, there'd been virtually no government expenditure at all. So, these people suddenly found themselves with a lot of money, but no experience. And what happened was that it took them a hell of a long time to get the programs up and running. For example, you're suddenly given maybe £1 million a year, and you think, okay, I've got to set up these new services. Oh, I need a new building. It takes you a year to get planning permission for that building. Then it takes you another year to build it. Then it takes you another year to train the staff to actually operate. So it's, it takes you a good 3 years from initially getting the money to actually having operational services. And that's what we found in the very early years, was this delay in getting services up and running because of you're setting up something completely new where there wasn't an infrastructure present. And Gordon Brown, for example, said after the first money was released, he said, Norman, how are those Sure Start programs doing? What's the results? The programs weren't even up and running, and he was expecting results. And that illustrates the sort of the complete lack of perspective that people in different elements in the political system have. Anyway, but 1,000 flowers bloom. You signed up to this general aim, but you could then take this money and do what you liked with it. Some of them set up parenting programs. Some of them would be highly structured parenting programs, like Triple P. Some would be completely unstructured parenting programs, what I feel would be good for parents. Some of them would do aromatherapy. Some of them would have trips to the seaside for the families. Some of them would have a childcare program. Some with high-quality childcare with trained staff, some with untrained. A huge range of things being offered. And we came in we won the contract, as it were, to evaluate this program. And what we found is, with these very early programs, very mixed results. Some of these programs seem to be showing some evidence of actually improving child outcomes, but many of them weren't. And some of them were even having negative outcomes. So, it was a very mixed thing. So what happened was, we presented our evidence to the Minister for Children, as then was. That's another interesting development which happened in parallel to this. We had a Minister for Children. We presented this evidence to the Minister, and we also presented evidence from the EPI project, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment, which showed that basically children's centres work. So what the Minister then said, okay, we've got the evidence. Sure Starts sometimes work, sometimes doesn't work, but children's centres work. We're going to make every Sure Start program become a children's centre. Okay? That is, instead of saying, let 1,000 flowers bloom, we're going to introduce a more structured service with clearer games, clearer patterns of service delivery, etc. And that's what happened. And by 2006, virtually the whole of Sure Start had moved over to a children's centre model. What we then found in the evaluation was that the results in terms of child outcomes were improving over that period. But then, in 2008, we had the big economic crisis hit, dramatic cutbacks in all public expenditure, children, Sure Start affected as well, much as anything else. And also, coincidentally with that, we had what we now realize was a dramatic political error. Up to this point, there were roughly 600 to 700 children's centres in poor areas around England. Okay? The government said, oh, everybody likes these children's centres. They're producing good results. Wouldn't it be wonderful if everybody had a children's centre? So they said, okay, we're going to announce a plan to have 3,500 children's centres by 2010, so that in every neighbourhood in England, there's a children's centre. Okay? Now, they didn't increase the funding. Okay? So what we had was a much more watered down service delivery being happened, by 2010, as because of trying to spread things too thinly, and the evidence started to go worse. And then actually our evaluation stopped in 2010. But also in 2010, another big change happens. We have a completely new government comes in, Conservative Lib Dem alliance. And that this government has come to power with a cost-cutting agenda, cuts across the board. Every public service to be cut by 20%. Okay? We lobbied the Treasury in those first few months of power, and we managed to get a situation where there were cuts in early years services, but the cuts in early years services were less than the general cuts across public services. So in that sense, it was a minor victory. Okay? But still, there were cuts. And so, but also, the Conservative government viewed Sure Start as like a, the invention of the devil. It was so there was a lot of problems in getting them to divert money to Sure Start. So from 2010 onwards up to now, we're now seeing this kind of sideways drift of the whole Sure Start program. And we had a parliamentary commission in 2013, just this last year, and a number of us have been giving evidence to this parliamentary commission on children's centres. And the chair of the commission reported that as a result of all of these changes, 75% of these 3,500 children's centres did not have any children in them. That sounds utterly, you're all gasping. That sounds utterly crazy, doesn't it? What had happened was, because of the cuts, etc., and all these various things, they just decided, providing all this childcare and early education was too expensive. We'll just concentrate on delivering some parent programs which are more, less costly, etc. Just do the things we can manage, etc. And so the whole nature of what we call the children's centre is now a very different thing to what was originally conceived. Okay. Yeah?
Just a quick question before you move on. In 2000, you talked about getting mixed results.
Yeah.
And there were mixed types of programs.
Yeah.
Was there a correlation?
I'm coming on to that.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. Okay, so let's think, what was a children's centre? Now, a children's centre was originally designed for the 20% most deprived areas, later expanded, okay? And it was basically meant to be a one-stop shop for all children's services, okay? Childcare. You wanted childcare? Go to your children's centre. You wanted preschool education? Get it from your children's centre. You wanted parent support, either through an explicit parenting program or some more informal kind of support? Get it from your children's centre. Health services, immunizations, health checks, etc. Other services, some of them had parent employment programs even involved, or parent literacy programs, etc. Okay, one-stop shop. That was the ideal model, and that model worked in quite a number of areas. The 2008, we found these beneficial effects for positive social behavior, self-regulation, reduced parenting risk, better home learning environment, more social issues. We also found improved results on child immunizations and child accidents. However, we have to be a little bit more cautious with these two because there was in the country a general improvement in those outcomes across the whole population. So it could have been that our results were polluted by that general trend. Although our statisticians tell us when they broke that down very fine, they're 99% certain that really a sure start effect. But to be conservative, we always reported our results very conservatively. We said, we can't be absolutely sure about those two, but they're there anyway. Okay, so it's for some very significant effects. Notice there's no effects on language development or cognitive outcomes. There's social development are the primary improvements. So why did we get better results later on? Now, the reason we got better results later on was because it took 3 years to set up a Sure Start program in adequately functional level. So the very early results, we were often looking at children who had a very immature program delivered to them. And also we didn't have the children's centers. So they got better results when they moved to a children's center, when the staff had become better skilled at providing services, they become better trained and so on. Okay. And then when we followed up the children at 5, we're finding that the improvement on social development had disappeared. But we still got improvement in health and improvement in parenting. And when we followed them up at 7, we found that there's similar results. Now, you might ask, why is it at age 3 we get better social development, but age 5 we don't? Well, the reason is because of the EPI study, which I'm just about to tell you about, in parallel to these changes in Sure Start, we got the introduction of universal preschool education for every 3-year-old in the country. So what I think is probably happening here is Sure Start is improving the social development of the kids, but then as those Sure Start children reach 3, everybody else in the country got preschool education. So between 3 and 5, they're all getting improved services. So in other words, our comparison group are getting improved services as well as the Sure Start. So that wiped out the social improvement effect, social development effect. Now, what we also found in the Sure Start areas was that there were several things which linked to some of the Sure Start programs producing good results and some of them not, right? And one of the things was the quality of early education and childcare measured at age 3. Those children in the Sure Start centers which had higher quality early childcare and education measured at age 3 had better language development outcomes measured either by us as part of the research study or measured by the teachers themselves in the schools who were doing this completely independent of our study on what we call the foundation stage profile. So that quality of early childcare and early education is one of the factors. And so if we're going to improve the outcomes for Sure Start programs generally, we need to focus much more on providing good language stimulation in these programs, because that was one of the things which was varying an awful lot among Sure Start programs. Let's skip that bit. And the other major factor which we found across Sure Start programs was that where Sure Start programs were integrated with health services, we got better outcomes. And this is primarily because the only people who have immediate access to every newborn child is the health visitor. So if the health visitor is integrated with the children's center, you get immediate contact with every new baby in the population. And if over the early months of visiting that family, the health visitor says, oh, I can see, you're having a feeding problem or a sleeping problem or a behavioral problem or whatever it might be, this child's very irritable and you're having some difficulty coping with this irritability. Well, do you know there's a parent support group down the road? Why don't I take you down there and introduce you to them? We should be in the children's center. So you've got immediate integration of those families with need into the services they needed. Other Sure Start programs around the country did not necessarily have that good integration with health services, and they didn't get such quite good outcomes. Okay, so that's some of the sort of quick run through some of the main evidence, 0 to 3. How about 3 years plus? Well, this is when the EPI study sort of kicks in. And first of all, there's some international evidence. You probably all know about the Perry Preschool Project, 123 African-American children in extreme poverty, randomly assigned at age 3 to either getting a program of early childhood education from 3 to 6, or no program at all. And the program was this very highly developed high-scope program with planned learning activities and weekly home visits to the families. And this is the results up to age 40. These children are now in their 50s. Okay, so this is the results up to age 40. The red is the program group, the blue is the no program group. The likelihood of earning more than $20,000 at age 40, much better in the program group. Likelihood of being employed, much better in the program group. Owning your own car, better in the program group. Having a savings account, better in the program group. So on all those economic indicators, the program group's doing better. Behavioral indicators, discipline problems in school, less in the program group. Being arrested more than 5 times, less in the program group. Violent crime, less in the program group. Drug crime, less. So on all those behavioral indicators as well. Very long-term effects for these very disadvantaged children. And this is the data on the cost benefits. The program from age 3 to 6 cost about $12,000 per child. When you add up the benefits, the savings as a result of improved education, less crime, less welfare dependency, less early teenage pregnancy, etc., whatever, you find the benefits are about $88,000 per child. A return on the dollar of 7 to 1. $7 back for every dollar you spend. By age 40, that had increased to $185,000. A return on the dollar of 16 to 1. So immense long-term savings. You won't get that in the general population, which, so you need to think this is a very disadvantaged population. So we need to think, what would happen in the general population? So this is a study in the general population, done in England to begin with, and I'll tell you about Northern Ireland as well, where what we did is we started the study in 1997. Now in 1997, remember this is before Sure Start, before the Labour government came into power and did all these new things, when there was no government expenditure on any preschool child, okay, except if that child was recognized as being at risk, okay? So if you knew there was a definite risk for that child, you might intervene in some way. But otherwise, no government expenditure, okay? There were preschool facilities. Some of them were preschool facilities provided by the local authority, usually in deprived areas where the particular local authority, because of its particular policies, would introduce that. You get a church may provide preschool facilities. A local community group may produce preschool facilities. A private organization for private day nurseries and so on. So we looked at all the kinds of preschool centers that existed in England. Nursery classes, things that, preschool groups attached to schools, play groups, usually community groups or church groups, private day nurseries, nursery schools, which are separate preschools run by the local authority daycare centers, which would take children in from birth onwards, often at-risk children, but not always. Then we have integrated centers. Now, the integrated centers are what we came to call children's centers. Now, at that time, they weren't called children's centers, and they were and we only had 7 integrated centers in the study. Because at that time, they were very revolutionary. They were pioneering centers. Okay, so there weren't very many in the country. And then we had groups of children at home who didn't have any kind of center-based provision at all. And we took a great deal of information on these families, parent education, social class, income, what was happening in the home, and we looked back to birth, birth weight, early health problems, childcare from birth onwards, etc., any traumatic experiences, and took measures of the child's cognitive, language, and social development at age 3, looked at the environments those children were in at home as well as in the preschool setting, assessed the children's development at the start of school, then regularly throughout school, and so on. And we're now about to report on those children when they're age 16. Okay? Well, what did we find? Start of school. We looked at some of our children were in this preschool group for 1 to 2 years. Some of them were in an extra year, 2 to 3 years. And if we look at the months of developmental advantage that the children had on literacy scores at the beginning of school, we found that the children who had more preschool were doing better than the children who had some. And the 0 line is the children without preschool. So they all did better than the children without preschool. Then we had low quality, average quality, high quality preschool. And we see quality matters. So both quality and duration matter in the preschool experience. And on producing important effects. Look here. This is a child who's got 3 years, probably started at age 2, preschool experience in a high quality center compared to a child without preschool experience at all. He's almost 8 months in advance developmentally of the other child at the start of school. And the start of school in England is 5 years. If you show an 8-month developmental advantage when you're 5 years old, that's a huge difference. Okay? Now, I'm going to jump, because I can see I've already taken more than I should. What we did is we had 3,000 children, so we're able to do complex statistical modeling of how a range of factors operate in affecting child outcomes simultaneously. So we'd have child factors, birth weight, gender, ethnicity, family factors, parent education, family social class, family income, number of other children, home learning environment. What was happening in the home which might stimulate learning? Preschool, the duration of preschool, the quality of the preschool. Primary school, secondary school. Now, in the case of primary school and secondary school, what we did is we took the data for every single child in the country from national data sets, that's 600,000 children in any 1 year, in, say, 16,000 primary schools, and we'd have the scores on those children at the start of school and at the end of school, and we know if they were living in a poor family, we know if they're living in a deprived area, we know their ethnicity, we know what age and year they were, and various other factors like that. And controlling for those background factors, we looked at how much progress the children made over the course of their time in the primary school or in the secondary school. And what we had is allowing for their initial attainment and their background. Some children would perform as expected. But some children in some schools would perform above expectation, and some would perform below expectation. So we had what we call highly effective schools, average effective schools, or very comparatively ineffective schools. And we had those measures of effectiveness for the primary school and the secondary school. And then we can look at an outcome like literacy, or numeracy, or sociability, or behavior problems. And we can look at how those factors affect those outcomes at different age points. Okay? What do we find? Age 11. Every child in the country takes the same test in literacy and numeracy and also science. Okay? Here are the results for literacy and numeracy. Red is literacy, blue is numeracy. And these are standard deviation units measured over here. I'll explain that to you if you like, but it's basically just a rough and ready measure of equating measures across many outcomes. Family income. Kids in rich homes do better on literacy and numeracy than kids in poor homes. Okay? Mother's education. If the mother has a degree, the child does a hell of a lot better on literacy and numeracy than if the mother has no qualifications. Father's education. Again, if the father has a degree, better. Look here. Father's education is half that of mother's education. Okay? Now we know fathers are only half as important as mothers. Or alternatively, we should tell all these fathers to get off their butts and do a hell of a lot more with the kids, because that's why this difference is emerging. It's interesting. This effect of father's education was almost zero in the preschool period. It gradually improves across the school age. Then we have socioeconomic status, professional occupation, unskilled occupation, allowing for all the other factors there. Then we have the home learning environment. Now, we measured the home learning environment at age 3, age 6, age 10, and age 14. But it was what made the big difference was the home learning environment measured when the children were 3 years old. Okay? So this is the home learning environment measured when the children were 3, and this is 8 years later. We're seeing dramatic effects on literacy and on numeracy, having allowed for all of these other factors. Okay? This isn't just. Now, we do find that more educated parents do more in terms of home learning environment. But the correlation is 0.3. That is, more educated parents tend to do more of it than less educated parents. But it's only a weak association. So we get many unqualified parents who'll do a lot of it, and conversely, we'll find some highly educated parents who don't do much of it. So we can separate out the effects. And then we have, so those are all background factors here. Then we have the effects of going to a high-quality preschool. Literacy, numeracy. Look, those effects on numeracy are much stronger than effects on literacy. Okay? Going to a highly effective primary school. Literacy, numeracy. Okay? Look at these two effects here. Preschool and primary school. They're almost identical. Yet the average child in this study had been to a preschool for 18 months. They'd all been to a primary school for 6 years. Okay? I'll leave you to work out the consequence, how you interpret that. Okay? We can also look at the effects of going to, say, what we would call a highly effective, high-quality preschool, but then going on to, say, a low-effective primary school, or an average primary school, or a high-effective primary school, and vice versa, all the different combinations. We could look at that. So these here, this group here, are children who went to the low-effective preschools, the not so, if you like, the not-so-good preschools. Okay? Then, in yellow, is if they went to a low-effective, oh my God. I should have one of those pointers. Will it come on? It's coming on gradually. It's coming. Sorry. Sorry to be so clumsy. Okay. I'll talk you through it. What we see is, for the kids who went to the low effective preschools, the effect of going to a low effective or average effective or high effective primary school is very dramatic. It makes a huge difference to those kids. Then we have the kids who go to the average preschool. And we find, well, if they go to a low, average, or highly effective primary school, it makes a difference. It's important. But not such a big difference as the kids who went to the low effective preschools, okay? Then we have the kids who went to the most effective preschools of all, the top 15% of preschools. And we look at whether they go to a low effective, average effective, or high effective primary school. Makes no bloody difference. The kids who went to those highly effective preschools learn despite the quality of the teaching they encounter when they're in the primary school. Then they've learned to learn, and they'll learn anyway. We actually find this in the a similar phenomenon in the national data sets for all children in the country, when we analyze the data sets for every child in the country, you find that those children who are initially very high ability are comparatively unaffected if they go to a low effective school or if they went to a high effective school. Here, you see? Virtually no difference here. Low, medium, high effective. These are the children who went to the best primary, the best preschools. You see? It's as if going to a really highly effective preschool inoculates the child against the effects of bad teaching later on. I mean, maybe an overstatement, but it shows you the nature of the effect. As I say, in the national data, children who are high ability at the start of school are relatively only marginally affected by whether they go to a high, average, or a low, average, or high effective school. On the other hand, children who are initially low ability are dramatically affected by the quality of teaching that they encounter. Okay? Now, in terms of, if you have any education policy people here, what that tells us is, to the extent we know we have very high quality teachers, whether in the preschool or the primary school, and we don't have enough of the high quality teachers so that every school child can't necessarily have the high quality teacher or the high quality school or whatever. Concentrate your best resources on your lowest ability, most disadvantaged children, because there's where you'll find the biggest bang for your bucks from the high quality teaching. Unfortunately, in most education systems, the opposite operates. Because it's actually much easier to teach in where the teachers often enjoy teaching high ability children more, and because the high ability teachers often have more choice about where they go, you often get an accumulation of the high quality teachers with the kids who don't necessarily need as much. Okay. Okay, when we look at 14-year-olds, similar pattern. We see family income, mother's education, father's education. The gap between mother's and father's education has decreased a bit by the time they're 14. Socioeconomic status, home learning environment. High quality preschool, still having these dramatic effects at age 14. Primary school, the effects for literacy have dropped out for primary school, but for numeracy still there. And then secondary school, dramatic effects for secondary school. Big effects for secondary school. And this is a phenomenon which is peculiar to England, I think. In England, we've got primary schools fairly well sorted out. I'm not saying we got everything perfect, but our primary schools are not too bad. We don't have comparatively few really bad ones. Okay? In secondary school, we're a mess. The difference between the worst secondary schools and the best secondary schools in England is enormous. So that's why we're finding this very big effect of the kind of secondary school that a child goes to. And to some extent, it wipes out the effect for primary school for literacy, because particular primary schools feed particular secondary schools, and so the primary school effect gets absorbed into the secondary schools. Yeah?
How do you assess quality of primary schools?
That was the effectiveness measure I was talking about earlier, where we look at the scores of the children at the start of school and then at the end of school, allowing for background factors, how much improvement do they make? Yeah. Okay. I can't tell you the 16-year-old results because we're not supposed to release them for a couple of months. But I can tell you the 16-year-olds look remarkably similar to that. Okay. Now, here's something. Now, we have similar kinds of measures at different ages. So we can look at, in this case, a numeracy, numbers, children's capacity to handle numbers or number skills. At 3 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, 10 years old, and 11 years old. Okay? Now we can do that for 3,000 kids. And if we plot those trajectories for 3,000 kids, you see a lot of lines crisscrossing across the page. And it'll look a complete mess. You won't know what to make of it at all. But then we can then do something which we call group trajectory analysis, where we look at all those individual trajectories and see whether they cluster into common patterns. And what we find is that most of the 3,000 children fall into one of these common patterns. And these are the 6 common patterns we find. This is the average, 0. That's one standard deviation above 0. We find some children start off being very much above the average, and they stay that way all the way through, okay? Then some other children start off again very high, but then they fall off and become about average. Then we have two big groups here who start off about average, and one of them climbs up and then scores consistently above average. One of them falls off and then falls consistently below average. Then we have a group who starts off way below the average down here, but they climb up and become about average. Then we have another group here, about 8% of them, who start off very, very low and they just stay low all the time. Okay? Now there are some exceptions to that and so on, but that's the general pattern of the data. Now, some of those trajectories are favorable, like 6 or 4 or 2. You know, you want your child to be in group 6. Clearly, very good scores. Or if it can't be in group 6, or maybe if it's in group 4, at least it's improving over time. Or, you know, if they start off not so well, but they improve in group 2 up to about average, okay, that's doing quite well. You wouldn't want your child to be in group 3 or group 1. Okay? So we can distinguish between favorable trajectories and unfavorable trajectories. And we can then analyze what changes the likelihood of being in a favorable trajectory versus an unfavorable trajectory. What is it? Good preschools and good home learning environment. And also primary schools make a difference as well later on. Okay? So the same message is coming through there. But there's another message. Put a vertical line there, up the graph. What's happening to the right of that line? To the right of that line. Nothing. Children are staying in the same relative position. All the change is taking place here. The preschool period. That tells us if you want to produce population level change, you need to operate in the preschool period, because by and large, other things being equal, children will tend to stay in the same relative position from the start of school onwards. Okay? How many primary school teachers here? Okay? If you know, I mean, you have a primary school class coming in at 5 or 6, okay? Would you be prepared to make predictions about who's going to do well at the end of the primary school and who would not? Yes, you would. You know at the start of school what those kids are likely to be like. You may get it wrong occasionally, but most of the time you'll be right. And that's basically the same message. Okay. Northern Ireland, replica study in Northern Ireland. They had 850 children in Northern Ireland. We only able to follow them from age 3 to 11. Basically the same results as in England. High-quality preschool improved their educational scores. So children who attended a high-quality preschool were 2.4 times more likely in English and 3.4 times more likely in maths to attain the highest grade at age 11 than children who hadn't attended a preschool. Okay? So I guess in Victoria, you'd like to increase the number of kids getting high grades in mathematics. Here's a good way of doing it. Okay? Fairly cheap way of doing it, actually, as well. Okay. Policy impact of EPI. We got a free part-time early childhood education and care place for every child in the country from age 3 onwards, passed in 2004. And that's why it interfered with the Sure Start results, because it got smack in the middle of the implementation of Sure Start. This free place has now been extended for the 40% most deprived children down to 2 years of age, as of 2013. We also had data on maternity leave, and we got maternity leave increased to 1 year after the birth of the child. We had a new early years curriculum introduced, to a large extent on the basis of the qualitative studies we did in EPI. We got new training programs for early years staff on the basis of showing the training of staff improved the outcomes for the preschool period. We got an acceptance that early years spending is part of government responsibilities, and we also got children's centres. This last point is the thing about spending. The Conservative government, prior to the introduction of all these changes, had not been spending anything on the early years. Remember, they came in 2010 with a cost-cutting program yet the costs for early years were cut less than for the rest of the public. So we even got the cost-cutting conservative politicians to accept that this was now part of government responsibilities, which is a big change to where it was 15 years ago. So over the last 15 years, the whole early years landscape in the UK has changed dramatically. Okay, I've got a lot more. I think I've only got halfway through my presentation. But I think I better stop there maybe for questions and so on. Okay.